Cool. Yeah, so hi everyone. I'm Mark Dalglish. And first of all, I want to say a big thank you to the organizers of this event and also everyone attending, because when I signed up to do this talk, uh, the whole coronavirus thing hadn't really become what it is now yet. And so it was, I thought I was going to have to pull out from speaking. It was very last minute, relatively speaking, that this turned into an online meetup. And so I'm actually feeling really grateful in a way that I get to be a bit of a pioneer here, at least, in my neck of the woods. It's my first time doing attending a remote meetup, let alone speaking at one. So thank you all for being here. I wasn't sure how many people would be here, so it's cool to see that there's currently 248. That is more than I expected. I got to be honest with you. So I'm very thankful that you're all here. Anyway, so yeah, I'm here today virtually. For a few reasons. The first one is, of course, that I care about design in a big way, and that's why I like this meetup, and what Chan was just saying about how it brings these two worlds together. Ever since the beginning of my career, or even before I started my career, I've been interested in design, and my interest in technology has always sort of been through this lens of what we can do in the design space as well. But equally, I'm very much into development. In terms of my job title, that's what I identify as a developer, but my day-to-day work, it's really about bridging these two worlds. So again, that's why I feel very, very at home in this at this meetup. But the long and the short of it, as far as design system goes, I think is that I think our industry is at a crossroads. I think that our design systems aren't fully delivering on their potential, which is a big statement. But the reason I say that is because as we're seeing, design is increasingly defined in code. The better our design systems get, the more opinionated they are at the code level in terms of what our products should look like and that sort of thing. But we're also seeing that our design workflows are struggling to keep up. We're trying to bridge the divide between the tools that designers use, the tools that developers use, and it doesn't feel like it's quite running the way we want to yet. So I think our industry has a choice to make about how we solve this problem. There's obviously a lot of work going on in this space. The first way to cut this is to bring code into our traditional design tool environment. And we're seeing a lot of that now with tools like FramerX and Interplay. Very interesting work going on in that space. Obviously very exciting. But there is also another way to cut this, which is designing in code directly, and actually using code as a design medium in and of itself. And this idea of design in code is really what I want to hone in on tonight, or today, or this afternoon, depending on your time zone. I really want to focus on this because I think that this is actually the one that has the most potential to really deliver on the promise of design systems. Because I think it's the angle that truly brings us together into the final medium. And the idea here, I think, is that there's potential for us to start literally speaking the same language. There's a lot of talk in the design system space about, figuratively speaking the same language. But unless we're actually working in the medium that our products are built in, I'm not sure that we're truly going to get there. So as many of you may know, I work at a company called Seek in Melbourne. Obviously at the global scale, they might not be super well known, although you may know us now for a lot of our open source work. Here in Australia, Seek's a household name if you're looking for a job. So I've been working there for a number of years now. And a big part of my work there is centered around the shared front-end tooling space, and particularly Braid, which is our design system. And as I alluded to, it's open source. So if you want to go check that out on GitHub, please do have a look. What I want to share with you tonight is how we're solving this. And hopefully you can take from that some learnings into your own design system work. So the three things I want to focus on are our tooling, the abstractions we're using, and the workflow that we're hoping to enable on top of these things. So to start at the top, I'm going to hone in on the tooling, particularly what the different tooling that we're using. So you may have seen me speak or tweet about this tool before, Playroom. It's an open source tool that we've built at Seek, and we use quite a lot. And the core idea of Playroom is this idea of JSX as a design tool. And if you're not familiar with JSX, it's the language that you express your React component trees in if you use React, but it also supports other UI libraries as well. So this is what it looks like in action. So this is the Playroom environment. It runs in a browser, and at the bottom, third or so of the screen there, you can see that there's a code pane, and you can start writing JSX. So JSX looks and feels very much like HTML, but the difference is that everything you see there is a component that we've defined in our system. Of course, if you work with design systems, that's probably pretty standard. But the interesting thing here is that Playroom is giving you access to everything in the design system without having to install anything, without having to set up anything in your browser. You just start typing your design language that you've defined in your design system, and it starts rendering into these iframes at the top of the window. So in our case, with Braid, it's a themed design system. So you can see here that for a single set of code there, I can see what it looks like across CKNZ, business. We've got a rebrand theme there for trialing new designs. We've got an older theme, so on. If you scroll that top pane across as well, it's responsive, so you get to see it across different screen sizes as well. So that's really valuable once you get closer to the code to sort of see, mechanically, how is this UI going to work in all these different environments. In our case, with a theme design system, it's pretty much, it'd be hard for us to do a themed design without a tool like this. That's very much where it came from. So as I kind of alluded to, the two really big benefits that you get from this being in a browser is that, first of all, it's zero install, which means that it's open not just to developers, but anyone with a web browser. So anyone, you just go to a URL and it fires up in the browser and you have everything you need to get going, which is really great. The other thing as well, of course, being in a browser is you get the huge benefit of shareable URLs. So as you edit the code, as you edit the code in that bottom pane, it gets encoded into the URL, and at any point you can copy and paste that URL somewhere else and share your work with anyone. So you'll often see that in practice that's useful when you're communicating with people over Slack, and you can show them what you're working on, or even if you're, say, experiencing issues with the design system, we use this a lot for support. So people will come into our support Slack channels and say, I'm trying to do this, but it's not quite working. Here's my Playroom link. It's been really, really valuable for us. For me, as someone who works on the design system, it's actually proved to be a really invaluable tool as a mechanism for test driving our design language. Because if you think about a design system as a product, which it is, what you need to do, as with any product, is to really get into the headspace of the user experience. And with a code-based design system like this, the user experience is actually in code. It's using the components and trying to compose up a UI. In the design workflow, you're trying new things, you're iterating, and that interface at the code level is very much the product, right? And so if you're working on a design system, it's really good to force yourself to go back to that blank canvas all the time and say to yourself, how quickly can I go from a blank Playroom window to a relatively complete UI? Because if your design system is doing its job, that should be really quick and it should be really easy. And so, yeah, this has been really good way for us to test that theory out. Now, I've quickly covered out the unique tooling that we have for dealing with these problems. The next thing I want to talk about is the abstractions that we have. Now, I have a very particular view on design systems, and that is that my job as a design system developer is to accurately model the way designers think. And so that means that the code that you see on screen when you're using Playroom really needs to be human readable to non-developers. It should speak in a language that we define that's based on the way our designers think and the way they speak as much as possible. Obviously, there will be times when the problem very much is a technical problem and there's no way around it, but most of your components should speak in very natural design-oriented language. And so that's very much my job, is to make that happen. But in order to get there, we're going to have to build up in layers. This is very much, your standard design system architecture, but I'm going to run through it anyway because it really forms the basis of how we build up to these higher levels. The lowest level, of course, is going to be your design tokens or your theme variables, depending on your perspective. So these cover things, of course, like your typography, your spacing, color, and so on, and your breakpoints as well is a really important one. If you want to standardize the way you handle layouts across different screens, for example, it's good to standardize on those breakpoints. And so you centralize these in JSON, or if you're using Sass or something like that, your Sass variables, whatever the technology is, those form your design tokens. So in the case of our design system, our white space scale is token based and it looks like this. So it goes from XX small all the way up to XX large currently. This is what we use for the seek theme within Braid. And so that means it really reins in the amount of options you have on a daily basis as you're iterating on your designs, which lets you move a lot faster. The next step up from this is to wire them up to primitives. And so for me, this idea of primitives in a design system was really inspired by the work of of Styled System. If you haven't seen Styled System, it's really worth checking out. So the core idea here is that you want to build these primitive components for you based on your design tokens. In practice, what that boils down to is a box component. So the box component is the thing that wires up your design tokens into individual elements on the screen. So this is what Braid's box component looks like. So here within Playroom, again, I'm rendering a card, and inside the card, I'm rendering a box with some text in it and an icon. But that box has low-level access to the design tokens, but those design tokens are using our own language that we've defined. So here I'm saying that the background is positive light and the padding is medium. So the important thing to note here is that I've really cut down the ceremony required to get an element on the screen that looks the way it should based on our design rules. So you'll note that I don't have to create a style sheet and use some variables and assign those to a class name and then put that class name on an element. I can just start using this low-level language that's coming from our design tokens and going straight to this box component. The other idea that's really powerful here in terms of moving quickly that I stole basically from Styled System is this idea of responsive props. So what the idea of responsive props is that if you've centrally defined what your breakpoints are, so in our case, our system currently has a mobile, a tablet, and desktop breakpoints that we've defined. And because we've defined those centrally, it means that we can allow certain props on these primitive components to let you define multiple values for each screen size. And it's defined in a mobile first notation. So here I'm saying that this box has padding of small on mobile, and then from tablet upwards, which is 768 for us, the padding should be large. So again, you'll see that I don't have to jump out into a style sheet and write a media query and then wire that up to an element. I can just directly on this box component, just start defining responsively what this should look like. It's really, really fast, and it works in a Playroom environment. So again, using this example that we saw before, you can see that I can start to iterate very quickly in the browser in Playroom using our components. So I'm saying now that the padding is medium on mobile, but from tablet up, I'm iterating on large, X large, back to medium, and so on. And you'll see that the mobile screen on the left is not changing, but the one on the right is. So it lets me move really, really fast. The goal here is really to make writing CSS the exception and to work as much as possible inside this component environment. Because again, we're trying to make it so that the components capture our design language and you're not getting hung up in the technicalities of whether it's HTML or CSS or so on. Yeah. Now, once you've got those primitives set up, you'll often move on to these higher level components like buttons, fields, menus, and so on. These are a lot less contentious. I think they're easier to get right. And a lot of times these are the first components that people build when they're building design systems. So I won't go into too much detail here. I'll assume that you'll probably be able to get these right more or less within your environment. But what I do want to talk about is this problem of layout. And this is a problem that we struggled with a lot in Braid for quite a while. And I feel like it's only relatively recently that we managed to figure this one out for ourselves. A big influence for me in this space was this really great article by Nathan Curtis called Space in Design Systems. And in it, he goes into really great detail about how you break down a UI like this, for example, into its discrete units of white space, how we think about it, how we name them, how we operate with white space scales like I spoke about before. And getting this right, I think, is really critical to getting a design system right, but often it's sort of the unsung hero of a design system, or it's even just really not implemented at all. So this is an area that I think if you invest in, there's a lot of upside to it, but it takes a different way of thinking to get it right. The core idea that took me quite a while to figure out is that this idea that components shouldn't contain surrounding white space. If you want components to be properly reusable so that you can use them in different scenarios and relay out a page really quickly, those components should have no surrounding white space at all. That's really the job of other components to handle. Really, the job of white space, it's owned by layout components. That's the idea that we've landed on with Braid, and we're by no means not the only design system in the world that works this way. But I would say that a lot of design systems that I've seen don't have this concept. So I think it's great that I get to share it with you, and hopefully you find it useful yourselves. But while this might all sound really obvious, potentially, this idea that you shouldn't have white space surrounding your components, there is a problem, and that's that the browser actually breaks this rule right out of the gate. So to explain what I mean by that, here's a basic example. This is a text node rendered in a browser, and it's just a plain old H1 as the browser natively renders it. And you'll see that I've rendered the words "Hello World," and I'm inspecting it in my developer tools, and my developer tools are telling me that it's an H1, it's white, it's 32 pixels. But if you think about what I just said before, that components shouldn't contain surrounding white space, you'll see that this is actually breaking those rules. So if you think from a visual design standpoint, the top of this text node cuts across the cap height, but you'll see that there's this gap here between the top of the capital letters, the top of these L's, and the top of its bounding box. And you'll also see that it's the same at the bottom as well. There's no descenders in this text, so there's no G's or Q's or anything like that. But what you would expect from a design perspective, if you were laying this out in a design tool and trying to get your white space perfect, you'd be considering the bottom of this H, the bottom of the E's and the L's, cutting all the way across the baseline of the text. You'd expect that to be the bottom of the element. But again, the browser is giving us this extra space top and bottom. Technically, what's going on here is the way the browser works here is it's rendering the bounding box as its line height. So whatever this line height is set to, that's the height of this bounding box. And then the text is just kind of visually centered within that box. So again, what that's doing is it means that the browser is introducing white space that the designer is not really considering as part of their layout if they're trying to get it pixel perfect. So that means that if I do something like this, I render a bunch of H1s on top of each other, very contrived, I know, but if I just render a bunch of H1s one after the other, it's going to look something like this. Now, again, this might look totally normal to you because this is just the way the browser works. But if you think from a visual design standpoint, you'll see that the white space, first of all, is not visually balanced. So if you look at the space between the corner of this H and the corner of this card, you'll see that there's more space above the words than there is to the left of it, and same at the bottom as well. So that means as a visual designer, if this is what I was trying to create and I wanted that space to be even on all sides, already the browser's kind of put me off on the wrong foot. So that means that as a developer, the only way I can kind of fix this is to start hacking and start chucking negative margins on things. Oh, excuse me. All right. So how do we fix this? This is a problem that we're going to be fighting left, right, and center if we don't solve this at a low level. So what do we do about it? So in Braid, our solution looks something like this. I've cut out a bunch of calculations for the sake of brevity. You can go look at the code on GitHub if you want to see how this works. But you'll see that there's two steps that we're performing. First, we're using a CSS transform to set the text, set the baseline of the text on the bottom of its bounding box. And then what we're doing is effectively a crop of the top of the text node. Now, CSS doesn't let us crop per se, but we do. But the way we achieve it is by having a pseudo element that's display block before the text node, and we set a margin top of negative height correction that we've calculated. So that pulls it up in the document. So if we, rather than using the H1s that we saw before, if we swap them out for these heading components that come from our design system, and we stack those, you'll see very different behavior from what we saw before. So now there's no white space above and below the text nodes. And importantly, that means if we stack them inside of a container like this, so our card has equal padding on all sides, that means that there is equal padding between the corner of the text and the corner of the card at both the top and bottom of it. So that means from a design perspective, we're free to start reintroducing white space in a very deliberate manner. There's only going to be white space around things because we put it there, not because the browser just inadvertently added it for us. Importantly, this really turns a corner for our design system once we've implemented this, because now text behaves like every other component. And often that's what you struggle with, is if you might have a button, for example, and your button has 0 white space around it, but then you render a heading or some text and that does have some white space around it. And so now you have to treat those two different types of components differently. This solves that problem now. Text is no different to anything else in your system. And that once you've set that up, that means you're now free to create a consistent set of layout components that don't have to behave differently depending on whether it's text or some other type of component. So what I'm going to do as a way to demonstrate this is show you some examples. The first is the famous stack, which has been gaining a lot of popularity, I think, somewhat due to me having been speaking about this quite a bit, but I know that it's such a, I didn't invent this idea, and it's such a good idea. It seems to be catching on with people quite a lot now. This is my favorite layout component by far, because you use it everywhere. This is what it looks like in practice. So here is a card in Playroom, and I'm rendering a stack. So inside the stack, we've got a few sibling components there. We've got a heading, we've got a text, we've got an actions component. And what the stack does is it automatically inserts space between all its children. So what's really nice about this from a design perspective is it means that you can keep the white space even between everything just by changing a single value. So that space value at the top in that stack component, that's all I need to change to revise this entire layout. And so that means that you can iterate a lot quicker using the system itself directly. And again, you're using the code that you would typically be running in production, but you can use it in the design flow because it's so iterative. Another version of this this way of laying out components is the inline component. So the inline is useful for things like this. Like say you want to render a bunch of badges at the top of a card. What inline does is it lets the content wrap. So it runs left to right and wraps down. And the space here is consistent both vertically and horizontally. So that what you'll see is that if all the badges fit on a single line, there'll be no space above and below. But if they wrap to a second or third line and so on, you'll see that the space is inserted vertically between these elements. But again, from a design perspective, not from a code perspective, this takes out a lot of work in terms of standardizing the white space between a bunch of items in a collection. So all the finicky work of trying to lay everything out carefully kind of goes away, and you can move really, really fast at the code level. Another really powerful one for us is columns. This one's obviously a lot more normal for people. Columns is a very common concept. So here I'm rendering 3 columns. And again, similar to what we've seen before, I'm tweaking the amount of space between the columns by changing the space prop. And it's equal between every single column. The idea is that you shouldn't have different space between different columns. It's really only, like if you have, the idea is that if you have different amounts of space in different areas, those that must be like nesting. So you might have columns within columns, and you'll have consistency between each set. This is where the idea of responsive props really starts to shine as well, because if we've solved it at that lower level at the box component, we can now start making our layout components also behave differently across different breakpoints. So in practice, what I mean by that is, like, we can say that our columns component, the space is now responsive. I can say that on my mobile size screen, I want to have small space between my columns, but on tablet size upwards, I want to have large space between my columns. Now, if you've done your job well, your components should make sense to non-developers. You know, this is really the theme of this kind of work to me, is trying to make it so that these components don't read like something only a developer would understand. They read like natural language that you might use in a design meeting, purely with designers in the room. Which opens the door for us to start prototyping in code, which to me is really, I very much view this as kind of the goal of design systems. It's to try and get us closer to the actual product that we ship to users. Because to me, I think the best designs happen when we're in the same room for starters, but when we're at the same machine, looking at the same product, looking at the same medium. So when you make a decision in code and you ship that is literally what the user is going to see. There's no sort of translation step where the developer has to reverse engineer from the picture. Like you're iterating on the final product. Now, the best way to demo this is with an actual demo, I think. So what I've done is I've prepared a Playroom environment over here. So again, as we saw before, this is what Playroom looks like. I've got my code pane here at the bottom, and I've set up 2 frames here. It's configurable, so I can open this and you can see I've chosen one of many themes. And I can also choose my screen sizes. So I've narrowed it down for simplicity at the moment to say I want 320 and 768. These are all configurable. Now I can start typing. So I can say I want a box with a background and so on, but that's quite laborious. What I'm going to do instead is click this plus icon that we've got over here in the toolbar. When I click that, it opens up this list of components. I'm just going to expand this a little bit. So I can scroll down and start seeing every single component if I want. You know, that's one way to familiarize yourself with the system, but I'm not sure it's the most efficient. What you can do, though, is you can start typing and it'll start filtering down the list. So what I'm going to do is run through the process of doing a bit of a mock-up in the browser. I'm going to do like a search form and maybe a basic dashboard, but just to keep it simple for now. So to start with, I'm going to have a blue box at the top of the screen. I've got this snippet here of a branded box. So I can arrow through these and see the different things, but I'm going to go with this one. So if I hit enter, it's dropped the code into the code pane at the bottom here. So you see I've got a box with a background of brand. I've got padding X of gutter, and I've got padding Y of large. And inside I've got this placeholder component that we built. So our design system, when it's in the Playroom environment, we expose this placeholder, which is really, really useful when you're doing these sorts of layouts and you're not exactly sure yet what you're going to put in there. Okay, so what I'm going to do inside, whoops, what I'm going to do, come on. What I'm going to do, I'm going to close that so I don't do that again. There we go. So what I'm going to do is replace this placeholder with a 3-column layout. So I could click this plus again, but I have a keyboard shortcut. Here we go. So I'm going to hit Command K, and I've opened up my list. Now I'm going to say that I want some columns here, and you'll see I've got 2 columns collapsed below tablet. So if I flip between these two, you'll see that the mobile layout is changing, but not the tablet version. I want a 3-column layout, but because it's a search form, I really want to collapse below tablet because that form is going to go vertical on mobile. So there we go. This is particularly useful, like even if you're a developer and you know how to type this code, you know, that's a fairly decent amount of code that it's just written for me. So even as someone who knows how to write code, this is a very useful feature for me. One thing that's interesting to note is that we've realized that when it comes to layout components, anywhere that you want to insert more component, it's useful in our snippets to just wrap them in stacks so that I can start adding more components within that context if I want. In this case, that's not really what I need. I'm going to have one thing per column. So I'm going to start replacing these. In the first column, I'm going to put a text field. So I'll type text field, and we've got a few versions of that. So we've got a standard one, optional, with error, with description, and so on. There's one with an icon. I'm just going to go with a basic text field here. So you'll see it's dropped text field with a label of label. I'm going to replace that with what, because that's our keyword field. I'm going to replace the second column with another text field. So here, this stack, get rid of that, and I'll put in here a where, because that's our location field. And then in the final column, I'm going to add a button for submitting the form. So I'll type button. The first thing it surfaces our actions component, which is more used at the bottom of a form. You know, you can see it's got like a cancel button and it goes full width on mobile. That's not quite what we're looking for in this context. We just really want a button by itself. We've got a few variants that we've surfaced. So we've got our standard button, we've got our strong button. The strong button uses our brand color, so that's what we're going to use here. And just for some good branding, we'll chuck the word seek in there as our button text. Now at the bottom, what I'm going to do is add a card for our dashboard. And I'm going to add an overflow menu as well. So I've got an overflow menu here in the corner. I can start adding to that as well. I'm going to replace this heading with the text dashboard. And there's our overflow menu. And then down here is the text that we've added. So I'm going to add some tiles to this. This is a layout component that I didn't talk about earlier. So here you can see I'm choosing what style of tiles I want to get started with. So here I've got 2 columns with small space. 3 columns with medium space. So I can choose the one that sort of is closest to what I want. I can still change it after the fact, obviously. This one's probably closest to what I had in mind. So here you can see our tiles have small space. We've got a bunch of placeholders, but importantly here, I've got a responsive prop for columns. So yeah, I can start iterating on some of these values. What I'm going to do is kind of work down the screen and start to iterate on some of these details, some of which are obviously wrong right now. So the first thing that's bothering me when I look at this is that the seek button is like floating up at the top of these columns. So luckily on our columns component, we have this prop called align Y, and that lets me align it to the bottom of the columns. So you can see now that on desktop, that button is at the bottom of that set of columns, which is pretty cool. All right, what else can I do? So the next thing I guess is that on mobile, it doesn't look too bad, but on this tablet size, the white space inside of this box is a bit tight. Like I kind of want to make this a bit more of a hero element on the screen. So I can start to iterate on this white space. Okay, what am I going to do? So this box here, I've got padding X of gutter, padding Y of large. I might want to start making these responsive so that I can tweak them on the different screen sizes. So the first thing I want to do is add a bit more space top and bottom to this blue box. So I'm going to turn this into a responsive prop. I'll leave it as large for now, and then I'll say, let's say X large. I've got one level. So you can see now I've added a bit more white space here. I could even go up one more maybe. Yep, like given this is the hero of the page, that probably looks okay to me. Equally, the horizontal space maybe could use some tweaking as well. So I'll do the same thing here. I'm going to say that, let's see, I'm going to say gutter here, and then I'm going to say on the larger screen, let's try large. That's pretty good. Maybe X large is too much. I mean, I can tweak it easily after the fact, so that's okay. Actually, now that I look at it, I do feel like the space top and bottom of this mobile version probably could use a bit more space as well. So if I go to padding Y, I've got large here. I could bump that up to X large on mobile, and I think that probably looks a bit better to me. The next thing is the space between these columns, particularly on desktop or tablet in this case, is a bit much. So what I'm going to do is this column space of gutter, I'm going to tweak that. So if I just change this here and make it X small, you'll see that it's changing across every screen size, which is not necessarily what I want. The mobile layout was actually okay for me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say I want it to be small on mobile and then X small on tablet upwards. And yeah, so that small is probably not quite enough. Let's make it medium or even large. Is large too much? I don't know. We can tweak it. We go either way on that one. Maybe large. Cool. So you can see here, I'm starting to bring these columns closer together. I could go down closer and say XX small, but that's probably too close. The next thing as well that's bothering me about this UI is that the seek button's pretty wide. And that's because this columns component is divvying up the space equally between all three columns. So what I'm going to do is go to this last column and I can tweak the width prop on it. Now, what my options are here is that I can say I want it to be a fraction, like half, a third, 2/3, and so on. But we also have this option called content, which says I want the content to be only as wide as the content within it. So in this case, what I'm saying is I want the column to be only as big as the seek button if it's left to its own devices. So if I say that the width of that column is content, you'll see now this button has shrunk down to sort of the minimum size based on the padding rules of our button. So this looks a lot more normal now. In fact, now that I've shrunk that down, I feel like I probably could give a bit more space horizontally here. So what I'm going to do is say, what are we? So we've got our box here, our padding X of large, maybe could be an X large now. And that looks a bit more normal to me now. Okay, cool. All right, so I think the search form's looking pretty decent. The next thing I want to iterate on is this dashboard. So you can see here I've got my columns set up. I didn't really think that I wanted like 2 columns on mobile. So what I'm going to do is change this mobile value of columns to a 1. And then the tablet size maybe could be a 3. But what's cool is that, it goes beyond mobile and tablet. I've simplified it for the sake of this exercise, but I can say here that I want to bring up a 1024 or even a 1400 wide. And I can scroll across and see what it looks like, and I can start to play with it. Like, so for example, this 3 column on a desktop size is probably a bit stretched out, maybe compared to what I had in mind. So I can add an extra value here and say that I want 4. So as easily as that, I'm saying I want 1, 3, 4, and I could even go higher depending on the number of breakpoints I've defined in my system. Equally here, I could see that this form is getting pretty wide, so I could start to deal with that and so on. So I won't go into too much detail beyond that. You can imagine that there's a lot more I could do with this, but I think this gives you a good idea of how quickly you can iterate in code with the design system directly. And what's great about it is that you're doing it in a way that, like, once you're happy with this, let's say you have done this in isolation and you haven't been working with a developer, you can grab the URL for this and send it to them in Slack and say, here's what I'm thinking. And they'll pretty much be able to take that into their code base, and you can start iterating from there. And so that gap between design and development really starts to shrink to near zero, where you, like I said, you are literally speaking the same language. But the idea, I would say, is definitely not that a designer will sit in a corner by themselves and use Playroom. For me, the idea is really to create an environment where designers and developers can work together and move at the speed that design wants to work at. So that, to me, that's really the goal of Playroom. All right, so if we flip back to our slides, like I said, the goal here for me with this tooling and design systems in general is to really make code part of the design process. I really want to get rid of this idea that design is something you do before you build something. Like, there's really no separation between the two. And I think our tooling needs to reflect that. So how can developers help? I know not everyone at this meetup is a developer, but even if you're not a developer, you should go tell your developers they should do these things, I think. The first thing I think developers need to do is to get involved with design. So in my case, what that means is doing things like actually going to the visual design catch-ups that happen every week where designers share their work, really trying to get a sense of where design is at your company and following along with the trends and following along with the new things that people are trying, because your design system needs to keep up with new ideas and not just standardize the status quo and stay there. You have to keep up. So that means that as a developer, you need to pay attention to how designers iterate, because a design system needs to handle all the iteration and not just translating the end product that might come out of a tool like Figma, for example. You really want to make sure that every single idea that you're seeing during the iteration phase is something that theoretically your design system could handle quite well. This is such a change for a lot of people that, that's quite obvious, I think. So what you need to do is find early adopters and offer constant support. So in my case, what that means is designers that really need to work this way. So in our case, designers that are working cross-theme, they're the ones that really need this tooling, because it's hard for us to even know how they would work otherwise. And so reaching out to them constantly, offering support in Slack. If they ask for something new in the system and it's reasonable, they get it pretty much straight away. Like the number one priority for us is customer support. We almost view it as like a product team might view a production outage. If someone says that this thing, they expected it to be there and it's not, and it's fairly straightforward, we just get it in there quickly. And that means that people really get rewarded for working with the grain of the system. They get a sense like if they adopt this thing early, they'll actually get to move it in the right direction very quickly. At the product level, I think what we need to do is encourage pairing between designers and developers. Sitting at the same machines, working in the same language, actually trying to make the end product better and not just make better looking mockups. And the key to that is really pairing, I think. And so getting that culture there as really part of the tooling, enforcing that that's what the tooling is meant to do, is really valuable. So for me, this idea really goes beyond, JSX as a way of expressing your design language, but it's a way of having a code-oriented design tool for everyone, not just developers. But as developers, that means that we need to start working to welcome designers into the fold and actually try and get them familiar with the tooling that we use and make it as approachable as possible for them as well. So if we do all these things, if we use code-oriented design tools, if we create the right abstractions, if we work closely with designers, and if we actively support these new workflows that are enabled, I think there's huge potential for us to really break down these barriers and start working closer together and build better products for our users, which is what this is all about at the end of the day. So I think if we work together at this, we can really start rethinking design practices to the benefit of everyone, both within our companies and at the other end of consuming the products that we build. But this isn't going to happen without your help. That's designers, that's developers, really rethinking the way we work, how we iterate, breaking down those silos, actually sitting at the same computers. Although I guess I got to watch what I say now because we're not literally at the same computers anymore. we need to pair over Zoom. How about that? We need to do that more and more, and really try to stop handing one, from one medium to the other. And it's going to take, people who come to a meetup like this are going to be the people that really drive this change. So I hope this resonated with you, and it's something that you'll take with you back to your work. That's it for me. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you. I realized I normally pause for applause, and then there was dead silence. So thank you.
That's awesome. So good. Thanks, Mark. That's really cool. Some awesome stuff there. Is that Playroom features you were showing, is that live now?
Yeah, I'll just a sec. I'll drop a link to it in the chat. But yeah, if you Google Braid Design System and you go to our website, there's a link to the Playroom on that.
It's really cool. We've actually got we've got Playroom integrated into our design system. I believe our developers upgraded yesterday, so I'm keen to sort of jump in there and play around with that as well, with our own components. It's really cool. Awesome. We have a bunch of questions here, so I might start inviting a few people up if that's cool, and we can ask Mark some questions. There's some great questions coming through. Just inviting Lewis up now to ask a question. Might invite a couple up at one time. We can start asking a few.
So just while we wait, I'm just posting. Whoa, that's a long URL. So excuse me, but no, it's too long. I need to shorten it. Hang on.
Hello, welcome.
Hello. Thanks for the talk. That was really great. I've been really wanting to do this kind of stuff at work, and we actually are starting this sort of thing at work. So I was just wondering if you had any tips for any kind of gotchas, kind of stuff you wish you knew at the start. Some, things like definitely don't bother doing a component for this, or make sure that, buttons are first kind of priority, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, luckily, I do honestly feel like what I presented tonight is the biggest gotcha in my experience, is managing white space, because I feel like that was the area that designers were struggling with the most when they would look at an end product that a developer had built with the design system, and they'd be nitpicking the white space, and we'd be looking at it going, I don't know how to fix this, basically, like in an elegant way. And it was really hard not to sort of feel like all this hard work we're doing just sort of comes crashing down when an actual, like, nitpicky, in a good way, nitpicky designer like looked at the end product and critiqued it, and it was as a result of going through that pain that we realized we really had to solve this problem. And the result of that exercise was what I showed you tonight. The biggest thing was the text cropping. I think cropping the text nodes is one of those things that it's a bit fiddly, but you do it once per font. And once you've done it, everything else just kind of, I found everything else just clicks into place, and you don't feel like you're fighting white space like you typically would. I mean, the other big thing I would say is, I think the responsive props is a really good one to get done early as well, because it's one of those things that once you get it working at a low level, it makes everything easier from that point. Doing responsive designs is no longer as much of a chore. You can move really quickly. I think those are the two main things. I mean, there's so many things that are good to do, but I think, those are the two big ones, I think.
No worries. I wouldn't have thought to do a layout and white space one, but it is something I try and go through and kind of do manually, which is annoying, and no one agrees on it in the end. So yeah, definitely a good one. Thank you.
That's awesome. Thanks for the question. Hey, Rihanna, just before you go, where are you joining us from?
Just Melbourne.
Cool. Awesome. All right. Thanks for the question.
So yeah.
Hey, Lewis, we'll jump over to you. Where are you joining us from?
I'm currently in Auckland, New Zealand.
Awesome. Welcome.
I used to live in Auckland.
Yeah, it's not a bad place to quarantine. We've had good weather so far. Yeah, I guess my question was, I definitely see the advantages of this in terms of like prototyping and getting stuff into code. When I'm designing personally, like I need to be able to design at like the speed of thought and to have like 8 options side by side. So yeah, I was wondering, like, do you see this as an endpoint that will kind of phase out vector-based tools like Sketch or Figma, or do you see is it something that will like live alongside those tools?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Like, so like, I mean, like I said, I'm interested in design personally as well. My day job isn't designing per se, but I love designing my own stuff. Like when we do hackathons at work, I'm often end up being the designer on the team, as you know, as well as a developer. Those times for me are a really good time to reflect on, you know, how much of what I say, like, how does it play out myself when I'm trying to do this sort of work? And for me, the way I think about it is that I will, if it's the very beginning and I have to define what does this product look like, and it's complete blank canvas, like I wouldn't do it in code. It's too slow at that stage because I need to iterate on so many things at once, like including like what fonts am I using or what colors, what like the actual design tokens themselves. I haven't even really defined those yet.
Yeah.
And so that's the point at which I'll definitely be using a more traditional design tool. And even in, I guess, even in a product sense, there's definitely room for being more conceptual. But I would say that, I guess for me personally, the more I've defined my design tokens and the actual design language is a bit more bedded down, I actually feel like the conceptual work can move to paper and pencil. Like I don't feel like I have to do hi-fi to the same degree, you know, because I don't have to solve those problems. I already solved them. It's more, I'm really solving more like UX problems really than visual design. Like where am I putting things on the screen and what are the user flows and that kind of thing. And so I would say that even a tool like Sketch to me is overkill for that. So I don't know. I think it's about, like you said, you want to use the tool that lets you move at the right speed. And I think that Playroom, if what you're doing is trying to spec out what a UI should look like, Playroom is ideally faster than Sketch.
Yeah.
You know, because you're using things you've already built. So yeah, it really depends. Yeah, I think I meant to call it out in the talk, but I think with Playroom, I've really got to be careful to not accidentally send this message that Playroom is a replacement for Sketch or something like that. Like whatever you're doing today in Sketch, do that in Playroom. Like that's definitely not the idea. I don't think that would work. But I think ideally it means that you don't have to spend as much time in these high fidelity design tools on a daily basis. So I guess we'll see how that plays out, but that's how I think about it.
I guess just another quick follow-up is, what percentage of the designers at Seek kind of use this as like maybe, what's a better way to frame that question is like, what's the adoption like amongst the designers at Seek? Like, is it something that most of the designers use every day, or is it like you're slowly trying to get this into their tool set?
It's complicated in the sense that Seek's a big company with a lot of different designers, and we don't really mandate tooling or workflows. What I would say is that there's definitely, like a lot of things, you see that there's early adopters. Because it is so different, not everyone jumps at it. The early adopters for us have definitely been the designers that have to do cross-theme work. They're the ones that get the most value from it because it actually makes their lives a lot easier to work that way. Because otherwise they don't really know, like, how is this thing going to look across these radically different brands?
Right.
And it takes away for them to draw it all up front and then have to debate all these details when it comes to build time. It's actually faster for them to just sit with the dev and like iterate on it together.
Yeah.
So we've definitely seen a lot of uptake there. And then outside of that, where it's not necessarily as much of a requirement per se to work, there's lesser uptake there, but I think you're seeing some early adoption from some designers who are probably more technically oriented, but we don't have a huge amount of them. One thing we have been doing is, when we were in the office, was running workshops with the designers to try and just at least get them over that initial hurdle of thinking that it's too hard, that's a developer thing. And we wanted to make them realize how it's actually not as hard as they think it is. But again, the message is definitely not that they should then go back to their desk and close Sketch and open Playroom. It's just that they should feel like they can work with a developer in between their conceptual work and going to production. There's an in-between step where it's like building live prototypes with the design system, and that's actually something that they could actively work on. It's not something that it's up to the developer to just translate that from a picture. Like, they can do that together.
Awesome.
Thanks, Lewis.
Yeah.
Good question. I believe Fiona. Hey, welcome. Where are you?
Hi. Hi. I'm actually from Melbourne. Well, I'm in Melbourne right now. I just moved from Auckland in February, way before the whole outbreak thing. Yeah, thanks again for the talk. It was really exactly what I wanted to hear. Everything. I've got two questions. So my first one is, how do you convince your developers and your team to attend talks like this, where you're trying to bridge the communication between developer and designer, cross collaboration? I struggle with that. I struggle with convincing my developers to attend talks like this and actually hear out that designers are just as equally important as well with developers.
That's a good question. I'm not sure I have a good answer for you. I mean, to be honest, this is one of those things that I struggle with, because like I said, my background from the very beginning, I've always been interested in design and development. And so it's almost like, to be honest with you, I almost don't fully understand developers that don't get involved with design myself. That said, I do feel like those developers that are less design or product oriented, maybe, I do think that the work that we're doing helps show them that, like, we can actually make their lives a lot easier by doing this work. So for example, you talk to the average, maybe more back-end focused developer, and they have got like mental scarring from working with CSS, and they just do not want to touch it. And like, I would say that, as I said in my talk, the idea, if you've done your components well, like, writing CSS is actually the exception, and you come up with an abstraction that's actually a lot easier than CSS, because it's designed for your design, like the design language that you have. And so what you'll find is that people who have kind of avoided design tasks maybe find it suddenly a lot easier to work in that space, and they're maybe more interested. That's the theory, though. I mean, I don't know how much that works in practice, but I do think that I think that back-end developers, a lot of them are just, they don't like working with bad abstractions, and if you give them a good abstraction, they'll actually really appreciate it, and they'll get more involved. But beyond that, I'm not sure either.
Fair enough. That's a valid answer. I just have one last question: is, do you see the future? I guess it's quite broad, but do you see the future of design schools, or even just like more those computer science kind of degrees, where they're actually integrating more of like the design and developer roles being more united, where they're actually creating functional products, functional prototypes, rather than just a beautiful Sketch or Figma kind of prototype? Where do you see that going with now classes being online, being remote? Do you think that could be a possibility to change?
It's a good question. I'd like to think they would, but like realistically, I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. Like, I do realize this is still quite a radical idea for a lot of people that have got very much. I mean, it's funny because I don't think it's a radical idea, or was a radical idea when I started in web development. Like, but I learned HTML and started learning it in '99, and back then, like, multimedia as a term was really big, and like, you know, playing around with design and like more techie things sort of under the same umbrella was very normal back then, I'd say. And like Flash was part of that as well. Like, you know, Flash as a tool, in a lot of ways, it's like we're still trying to get back to the world of the good parts of Flash, where you had a design tool and a development tool like in one. You weren't handing off from one thing to the other. So like, I think historically it wasn't that much of a, you know, a different way of working. It's just we're trying to culturally get back to it, and I'm not sure that's going to happen anytime soon. But I think there is, I don't know, I think there is potential there. That's what I'm part of why I'm talking about this, is I'd like to nudge it back towards that world where there's less of a divide there. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Fiona. Cool. I might actually ask a question on behalf of Christoph here. So the question is, what do you think about the impact of atomic CSS on visual layout editors? For example, changing props like in Figma or Illustrator.
Yeah, this is a good question. So I think this is what's really hard for our industry right now is we have such different tooling at the development level, I would say. Like if you forget design for a second, the way you implement a design system can vary so much. Like what UI library, if any, are you using? And even if, so let's say you've picked React, right? It's like, am I using atomic CSS frameworks like Tailwind, or am I using straight CSS, or am I using Sass or less? Am I using CSS and JS? If I'm using CSS and JS, like which of the many solutions am I using? And I think all of that makes it really hard for us to standardize on tooling. Because if you imagine you're trying to start a company that's trying to create some design tooling that works this way, you're going to struggle to support all of these different ways of attacking the same problem. And I think that's why with Playroom, my take on it is I'm betting really hard on components being that layer. Like, because if you think, like, you look at the code I was writing before, I was writing box with responsive props and so on to define what it should look like across different screen sizes. Under the hood, that is implemented as atomic CSS in our system, but that's sort of implementation detail. Like the component itself, you don't need to know how the component is working under the hood. It might be atomic CSS, it might be something completely different. And so I think if we agree that everything should ultimately be a component API, which I think is the right architecture anyway, I think it makes it more possible for design tools to then embrace that and say, well, if you give me your box component, if that's what you've got, and you tell me what the different props are, like we can surface that to the UI. And your design tool doesn't need to know that it's an atomic CSS framework. It just needs to know what options your box component has. I think that, yeah, no matter what the underlying implementation detail is, we can agree that a component API is what should go into the design tool. So, yeah, I think atomic CSS is really great, but I don't think that should be the public interface to your design system. I think that should just be the internals, like how it works.
Awesome. We might leave it there. There's a couple of other questions, but we might be able to answer them afterwards, just in the interest of time. So yeah, thank you very much, Mark. That was awesome. I'm sure there'll be a few people hitting you up on Twitter or in our Slack group later, or potentially even on here, we can maybe ask those few last questions. But yeah, well done. Thank you very much for coming on and giving that talk.
Thank you so much for having me.